Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories, they're whispers from the underworld, the kind that don't get told out loud. Hit that bell and step quietly into the shadows. South Philly didn't shine in the moonlight, it sweated under it. The air smelled like rust, bread, and the sour breath of too many secrets. Back then, in the 1930s, the neighborhood didn't belong to anyone. It was shared like a disease. Poverty, pride, violence, they all moved between row homes like stray dogs. That's where Nicodemo Scarfo was born, March 8, 1929. His mother called him Nicky. The world would call him a monster. He wasn't big, not tall, not broad, but there was a look in his eyes, even when he was a kid, like he was already halfway to violence, like he was born clenched. He didn't talk much. He didn't laugh like the other boys. He watched. And when he got hit, which he often did, he didn't cry. He remembered. The Scarfo family had nothing. His father was a laborer, mostly drunk, often gone. His mother prayed louder than she spoke, but it didn't bring much peace. The neighborhood was Italian, mostly, Catholic, violent. Respect was earned with fists, and later with bullets. As a teenager, Nicky tried boxing. Didn't stick. His temper ruined him. Couldn't take a jab without trying to end the other kid. No technique, just rage. That was his gift. Not brains, not charisma. Rage. When World War II ended, young men came home with medals, some with ghosts. Nicky came out of the shadows, a low-level street punk by then. Numbers, loans, light enforcement work. He had a way of getting people to shut up or disappear. That talent got noticed. He moved to Atlantic City in the 50s, back when it was still a rotting beach town with peeling paint and cheap sins. He ran with wise guys, real ones. Gambino connected, Bruno connected. Names you didn't repeat unless you were made. Scarfo wasn't made, not yet, but he had this reputation already. Little Nicky'll kill you for looking at him wrong. It wasn't a joke, it was a warning. He was 5'5" and pure nerve. Guys twice his size flinched when he walked into a room because there was no telling when he'd snap. He stabbed a guy once over a bar argument, some stupid nothing. Guy stepped on his shoe. Scarfo didn't blink, just pulled a blade and opened him up like a fish. The court called it aggravated assault. The streets called it something else, a message. He got locked up, spent time at the New Jersey State Prison, solitary. Most guys come out worse. Scarfo came out colder. By the time he slid back into Philly, the Bruno family had him on their radar. Angelo Bruno ran the Philly mob like a businessman. Quiet, diplomatic, low-key power. He didn't like Scarfo, thought he was too hot, too unstable. He was right. But the underworld doesn't run on morals. It runs on usefulness. Scarfo was useful. You needed a guy gone. You called Nicky. And so the small man with the big temper climbed the ladder one rung at a time. Knuckles, knives, whispers in alleys, bodies in trunks. No peace, no sleep, only the gun beside the bed. That's how he lived. That's how it started. The world had changed by the 1960s, but South Philly hadn't. The streets still hummed with the same tension, same smells, same rules whispered in alleyways and back rooms. If you owed, you paid. If you talked, you vanished. And if you wanted respect, you earned it, usually by hurting someone else. Nicodemo Scarfo was still climbing, quietly, ruthlessly. His name didn't echo across the city yet, but it rang loud in the corners where fear lived. Guys knew better than to cross him. You didn't look him in the eye too long. You didn't joke around him. He was too quick, too tense, like a dog bred to bite, just waiting for the chain to snap. He was earning now, nothing big yet, but steady. Loan sharking, some gambling, some muscle. He took a piece of everything he could touch, and he did it without drawing too much attention, at least not from the cops. But from within the family, it was different. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, was still running the show. Bruno wasn't a saint, not by any stretch, but compared to Scarfo, he looked like a priest. He believed in diplomacy, keeping the heat down, low profile, steady money. And he hated Scarfo. He didn't like the chaos Scarfo brought, the attention, the violence for its own sake. Bruno once told a capo regime in confidence, "That little bastard's got a screw loose. He'd shoot a man for stepping on his shadow." But hate wasn't enough to stop him from using him. Scarfo was exiled, on purpose. Bruno sent him to Atlantic City, the underbelly of the Jersey Shore, where the real money wasn't, at least not yet. Back then, AC was a broken-down beach town full of junkies, low-end gamblers, and cheap broads. A punishment, a dead-end post for someone too wild to be trusted in Philly. But Exile didn't faze Scarfo. He didn't whine, didn't complain. He understood the message. He understood how to wait. He worked from a diner booth in a rundown office above a storefront. His crew was small, guys like Lawrence Yogi Merlino, a thug with loyalty but not much brains. And his nephew, Phil Leonetti, who was still just a scared, wide-eyed kid watching his uncle like he was God. Scarfo made Atlantic City bleed for him. Little by little, he carved out control, vending machines, bars, local unions, even garbage pickups. The crumbs others ignored, he made his. He wasn't flashy. No big cars, no fancy suits. He didn't need to show off. His reputation did the talking. Stories floated up and down the boardwalk about how a guy tried to short him on a loan, ended up missing 2 fingers, or how a bartender who mocked him ended up in the hospital with a jaw wired shut. He didn't roar. He whispered, and men obeyed. Still, he was watching Philly from afar, watching Bruno, watching how the Don smiled too much, trusted too many. That bothered Scarfo. Trust was weakness. Trust got you killed. Then came 1976, the year that changed everything. New Jersey voted to legalize casino gambling in Atlantic City. The boardwalk turned into gold overnight. Suddenly, the city that was Scarfo's punishment became the hottest real estate in the underworld. And now, they wanted him back in the picture. Overnight, guys who laughed behind Scarfo's back were calling him Nick, sending envelopes, asking for favors. Bruno tried to keep a lid on it. He still didn't want Scarfo's hands on the big money. But things were slipping. Power was shifting. Scarfo smelled it. Opportunity. A way in. He knew he'd never be liked, but he could be feared. And in this life, fear always beat love. Still, he kept his profile low. He played the long game. Waited. Then, in 1980, fate finally turned in his favor. Brutal, ugly, and irreversible. Angelo Bruno was shot in the back of the head while sitting in his car outside his home. A shotgun blast. No warning. No speech. Just blood and silence. Philly's gentle Don was gone, and the streets cheered, quietly. Bruno had kept too many men down. Men like Scarfo. Men who believed in ruling with terror, not talk. His murder wasn't random. It was a coup from within. Carried out by his consigliere, Antonio Caponegro, a man too arrogant to understand that killing a Don without permission was suicide. Caponegro thought he'd be king. Instead, he ended up naked in the trunk of a car, beaten, stabbed, stuffed with money in every orifice. A message. The commission, the Mafia's governing body, had to clean up the mess. Philly was leaderless and chaos followed. That's when Philip Chicken Man Testa took over, Bruno's underboss. A scarred, seasoned man who understood both diplomacy and fear. He brought Scarfo back into the fold, closer now. Gave him breathing room, let him spread his influence in AC. Without restraint. Scarfo smiled, slightly. He wasn't king yet, but he was closer than ever. He started collecting more, enforcing more, bringing in his own people, guys who owed him. He trained Phil Leonetti, his nephew, like a son. Taught him the rules of blood, taught him how not to blink when a man begged. Then, in 1981, Chicken Man blew up, literally. A bomb rigged under his front porch tore him apart. Pieces of him were found on the roof across the street. No warning, no survivors. His house still smoldered when the FBI showed up. Again, Philly was leaderless. This time, Scarfo didn't wait. He moved fast, quietly backed by allies in New York, and surrounded by loyal killers, he seized control of the Philadelphia crime family. He became boss, the new Godfather. And just like that, a man once exiled, dismissed, and mocked now held the entire city under his thumb. But Scarfo wasn't like Bruno. He wasn't interested in keeping peace. He wanted fear. The first thing he did was clean house. Anyone who might question him, anyone who had ties to old leadership, anyone who looked at him sideways, they were dealt with. Salvatore Salvi Testa, the son of the man who blew up on his porch, was a rising star. Young, respected, dangerous. Scarfo saw him as a threat, so he smiled at him during dinner and ordered his murder the next day. Salvi's friends? Gone. Associates? Silenced. Nobody was safe. Scarfo turned the Philly mob into a dictatorship. Meetings were tense. Nobody cracked jokes. Nobody dared argue. Even his captains walked on eggshells. If he didn't like your tone, you disappeared. If he thought you were skimming, you vanished. If he had a dream you were planning something, that was enough. And yet, business was booming. The casinos brought in money hand over fist. Unions were under Scarfo's thumb. Construction, loans, extortion. He had his claws in everything. He was making more than Bruno ever did. But money didn't calm him. It made him worse. He became paranoid, delusional. He slept with a gun in his hand, moved safe houses weekly. His inner circle shrank to just a handful of men, and even they were scared stiff. Phil Leonetti, his own nephew, later said, he'd kill his best friend if he felt disrespected. That wasn't business. That was who he was. Scarfo once shot a guy in the neck over a comment about his height, 5'5", but you didn't ever call him Little Nicky to his face. But in the shadows, the feds were watching. Wiretaps, rats, surveillance vans disguised as flower trucks. The FBI was slowly building a case, not just one, a dozen. The violence was too loud now. Too public. Dead bodies were piling up in the alleys, and politicians were demanding answers. Scarfo, of course, didn't flinch. He thought himself untouchable. He wasn't. He never saw the real threat coming, not from the outside, but from within. And the first crack would come from the one face he trusted most. Power didn't make Scarfo calmer. It made him colder. By the early 1980s, Philadelphia belonged to him. Not the mayor, not the cops, not the priests. Him. The short, scowling man from South Philly who slept with a pistol under his pillow and trusted no one. Every dollar that moved in the underworld flowed through his fingers first. If you wanted to eat, you paid tribute. If you wanted to breathe, you showed respect. But power like that, it doesn't last. Not when it's built on fear. Not when the men around you start to look over their shoulders more than at their own drinks. Scarfo ruled through blood. That was his law, and that law meant everyone was replaceable. Phil Leonetti, Scarfo's nephew, was in deep by now. He wasn't a scared kid anymore. He was a made man. Scarfo had raised him like a son, and Phil soaked it in like religion. He dressed sharp, walked heavy, knew when to smile and when to stay quiet. Scarfo used to say, "You listen first, kill second." But Phil saw things that didn't sit right, like when Salvatore Testa got whacked. Salvi was smart, respected, the kind of guy other guys followed without being told to. He was also loyal to the family, to the business, to Scarfo. But that wasn't enough. Scarfo saw him rising too fast, saw the way people looked at him, the quiet deference, saw a younger version of himself, only more likable. And that was a threat. So he gave the nod. Salvi Testa was ambushed, shot multiple times, left in a ditch, no speech, no warning, just another body on the pile. Phil didn't say a word, but it burned, deep. And that wasn't the end. One by one, guys started vanishing. Frank Monte, Bobby Lumio, Pasquale Spirito. Some had whispered doubts, others had loyalty Scarfo couldn't stomach. Most didn't even know they were on a list. And Scarfo, he slept better with each one gone. He called it cleaning the blood. To him, they weren't friends, they were chess pieces, and every piece could be sacrificed for the king. But paranoia eats its own tail. Scarfo started watching even his loyalists with suspicion. If you hesitated when he asked you something, that was a problem. If your stories didn't line up word for word, that was a problem. If you showed up late, big problem. He'd call Phil into rooms just to stare at him in silence. "You talking to anyone? Huh? Anybody I should know about?" Phil would shake his head, swear on his mother. Scarfo would nod slowly, then say, "Good, don't make me question you." That was how he showed affection now, through threats. Behind the scenes, the FBI was patient. They didn't need to rush. Scarfo was his own worst enemy. Every new body gave them more leverage. Every funeral gave them another informant. The cracks were starting to show. The agents called him Little Caesar. They laughed at how he strutted around like a dictator, how his own people couldn't even breathe wrong near him. They weren't wrong. Scarfo's control was so absolute, he even demanded a cut from prisoners' commissary money. That's how deep the greed ran. And greed like that? It pushes people to talk. It started small, side guys flipping, low-level bookies giving statements. Scarfo didn't care. He thought they couldn't touch him. He'd paid off judges before, had half the cops in AC in his pocket, but the wiretaps were running, the recordings were building, and some of the voices they caught were ones Scarfo trusted. It wasn't just the feds. New York started watching too. The commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, wasn't blind. Philly had always been one of the smaller families, but under Scarfo, it was becoming a powder keg. The killings weren't strategic, they were personal. And personal meant unstable. That was bad for business. Scarfo's reach had started to irritate the five families. He wanted more turf, more tribute. He was pushing into Atlantic City with a hunger that ignored boundaries. Gambino guys didn't like that. Genovese guys didn't like it either. Scarfo didn't care. He once told Phil, "They ain't smarter than me. They just got bigger mouths. Let 'em try. But the more enemies you make, the less friends you've got when the bullets start flying." And they did start flying. Again. The Scarfo family had turned on itself. With so many power shifts, guys didn't know who to trust anymore. And when you don't know who to trust, you start making alliances behind the Don's back. That's what Frank Narducci Jr. did, what Nicholas Caramandi did. And when the heat came down, they sang. Loud. Narducci flipped, told the feds about dozens of hits, gave names, dates, bodies. Caramandi spilled everything, meetings, orders, how Scarfo picked his victims, how he smiled when guys begged for their lives. The FBI didn't just have leads now. They had maps, blueprints, play-by-plays. They were closing in. But Scarfo, he still thought he was invincible. In 1987, Scarfo was indicted on RICO charges, a laundry list of crimes from extortion to murder. But he walked into court with his hair slicked back in a tailored suit like it was just business. Even when they read out the charges, he didn't flinch. His confidence was real. He thought his lawyers could bury the evidence, thought witnesses wouldn't hold up. But this time, the walls actually crumbled. Witness after witness lined up. Guys Scarfo had fed, protected, made rich. They turned, said his name out loud in court like it meant nothing. Scarfo stared them down, his jaw locked, his eyes didn't blink. Phil Leonetti was at his side, watching it all, watching the empire fall. And then came the final crack, the one Scarfo never saw coming. Phil Leonetti flipped, his own nephew, the kid he raised, the one he trusted most. But Phil had seen too much. Watched too many senseless killings, lived in too much fear. And the final straw, Scarfo told him, cold as ice, "If I ever hear you thinking too much, I'll bury you myself." That was it. Phil went to the feds, gave them everything, testified against Scarfo in court. His words were deadly, more than any gunshot. He outlined Scarfo's whole operation, hit by hit, dollar by dollar, rank by rank. Scarfo didn't look surprised, just tired. In 1989, Nicodemo Scarfo was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. Just like that, the Godfather of Philadelphia, the man who ruled through pure terror, was done. No final shootout, no last words, just metal bars and the sound of the cell door slamming shut. In prison, Scarfo stayed the same, angry, bitter, still acting like he was boss, barking orders through prison phones, trying to control what was left of a shattered empire. But nobody feared him anymore. The streets had moved on, the Philly mob had been gutted. The new generation didn't care about Scarfo's war stories. They cared about staying out of the spotlight, staying alive. Scarfo died behind bars in 2017. Heart failure, no gunfire, no funeral parade, just another old man with a rap sheet and a legacy soaked in blood. But his name, it still hangs in the air when Philly wise guys talk, not with admiration, not with respect, but with a quiet, uneasy kind of fear. Because men like Scarfo don't get remembered for what they built, only for what they broke. Prison didn't scare Nicodemo Scarfo, not the walls, not the cold metal doors, not the dead-eyed lifers in the yard. He'd seen worse in the streets. Violence wasn't new to him. Death didn't haunt his dreams. He was the thing men used to dream about when they couldn't sleep. But the truth was, for a man like Scarfo, prison wasn't punishment because of the violence. It was punishment because it stripped him of control. And for a man who lived and killed by control, that was torture. When Scarfo arrived at the federal pen in 1989, fresh off a 55-year sentence for racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder, he walked in like a general returning from battle. Chin up, eyes forward, no weakness. He had his suit pressed, hair combed, didn't give the guards a second glance, didn't flinch when inmates stared. He still believed he was the boss, even behind bars. And for a while, that illusion held. Inside, he carried himself like a don. He had a few loyal guys doing time with him, old soldiers, men who still bent their heads when he spoke. He moved carefully, picked his table in the cafeteria like it was a throne. He didn't yell, he didn't bark, he whispered. Gave nods, tested loyalty one word at a time, and even inside prison, Scarfo had reach. He used prison phones to give orders to the outside world, still trying to squeeze the last drops of life out of what remained of the Philly mob. He spoke in code, used relatives to pass messages. Every dollar that came in from loans, rackets, or protection, he wanted a cut. He'd call lawyers and demand updates on street collections like he still had the final say. But things had changed. On the outside, the Philadelphia crime family was in ruins. Scarfo's reign had left behind a crater, not a kingdom. The leadership was fractured. Dozens of made guys were dead, flipped, or buried in court cases. The feds had crippled the whole machine. And worst of all, nobody wanted to carry on Scarfo's style of rule. The new generation of mobsters saw what his paranoia had done. The blood. The heat. The endless funerals. They didn't want to be feared. They wanted to be left alone. Low-key earners, smart enough not to chase headlines or body counts. Scarfo. He was the opposite of that. He was a symbol of everything that got the mob caught. And so the new bosses stopped answering his calls. One by one, they cut him off. Some did it quietly. Others told him straight, "You're done, Nick. It's over." That was the beginning of the long, slow rot. In prison, time stretches. 1 year feels like 5. And for a man used to power, used to snapping fingers and watching men die, Scarfo now found himself ignored. Worse, he was mocked. Younger inmates didn't fear him. They heard the stories, sure, but to them, Scarfo was just another old mobster talking about back in the day, like a broken record. They didn't care about Atlantic City or the Test-A-Hit or the mountains of cash that once rolled in. They cared about who controlled the phones, who could get a guard paid, who could get drugs in. Scarfo wasn't that guy anymore. He still had a sharp tongue, still looked at men like he was gauging their worth, but the weight behind his name was fading. The legend was being chipped away, slowly, quietly, like a Godfather left behind in time. What broke Scarfo more than anything wasn't the prison walls or the silence. It was Phil Leonetti, his nephew, his blood. The kid he raised like a prince, taught the rules, led into the inner circle, groomed to one day carry the torch. And now, that same kid was giving speeches in courtrooms, doing interviews with law enforcement, putting his face on documentaries. Phil didn't just testify, he talked, gave names, dates, emotion. He told the world who Scarfo really was, not just the boss, but the paranoid maniac who turned fear into his only tool. Phil admitted to murders, explained how Scarfo gave the nod, how they dumped bodies, how the phone calls came in like death warrants. And Phil, he got a deal. He got 5 years. 5. While Scarfo sat in a cell looking at 55. To say it stung would be an insult. Scarfo told one of his cellmates, "I should have buried that rat when he was 10. But deep down, he knew it was his fault. He made Phil into a killer, a soldier, a loyal dog, and then threatened him like everyone else. He didn't just lose power. He lost his legacy, and that kind of loss, you can't kill your way out of it. Years passed. Scarfo moved from prison to prison. Health declined. The weight dropped. His face thinned out. His hair grayed. But the fire stayed in his eyes, bitter, angry, ready to burn anyone who got too close. In 2005, he was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Minnesota, where older, sicker inmates spent their last days. Not a hospital, not really, just a slower grave. Even there, Scarfo tried to act like the Don, ordered guards around, demanded respect. But nobody cared anymore. The world had moved on. The Philly mob was under new hands. Less blood, more business. New kids didn't even remember the name Scarfo. And the ones who did, they called him the madman who ruined everything. Inside, Scarfo tried to keep his routines. Woke up early, did push-ups, read legal paperwork like he still had a chance. But the truth was clear. The war was over, and he lost. He still talked to his wife sometimes, his kids, his brother, the few people who hadn't turned on him. They sent letters, pictures, mostly silence in return. Scarfo wasn't affectionate, never was. But in the quiet hours, when the lights went out, and the guards locked the gates, and the hallway went dead, he'd stare at the ceiling and think of what could have been. If he'd been smarter, if he'd trusted just a little more, if he hadn't ordered every disagreement buried 6 feet deep. But regret wasn't in his nature, at least not in the way normal men feel it. He didn't say sorry. He didn't cry. He just grew colder. On January 13th, 2017, Scarfo died. Natural causes, heart failure, the report said. Just like that. No bullets, no betrayal, no final act of revenge. Just the slow shutdown of a body that ran on fear and violence for too long. He was 87 years old. No lavish funeral. No crowds of mourning mobsters. His name was barely mentioned in the Philly streets. Some of the new guys didn't even know who he was. His death didn't change anything. Because by the time Scarfo died, he had already been dead for years. Dead to the family, dead to the streets, dead to the code. But history remembers differently. To some, Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo will always be a monster. A bloodthirsty tyrant who turned Philly into a war zone, who made fear his currency, who stabbed his own shadows just in case they were plotting. To others, he was the last real gangster, the kind who didn't beg, didn't fold, didn't run. A man who took what he wanted and made the world bow, even if only for a moment. And to a select few, the ones who lived it, he was just inevitable. Because in the streets, the men who rise fast and burn hot don't last long. But while they last, they make sure the world remembers. And Scarfo, he made sure of that. The city didn't weep when Scarfo died. It barely blinked. No black Cadillacs lined the streets, no men in long coats standing with heads bowed, just a quiet footnote in the back pages of the newspaper. Nicodemo Scarfo, former Philadelphia mob boss, dies in prison. To the world, it was closure. To the few still breathing who knew him, it was relief. But inside the cracks of Philadelphia, those old stone row houses where the rules were never written but always followed, his ghost still lingered. Not in affection, not in myth, but like a stain that wouldn't wash out, no matter how many years passed. Scarfo had ruled with a grip so tight, It choked everyone beneath him. And now, the men who survived that reign were left carrying two things: memories and scars. Neither could be buried. Some of those men had tried to disappear, changed their names, moved south, got regular jobs. Others tried to stay in the life. But the life didn't want them anymore. Philly's mob world wasn't what it was. The feds had gutted it. Informants had burned the roots. The days of blood in the streets were over, at least for now. And that was the bitter truth left behind. Scarfo hadn't just destroyed his enemies, he destroyed the family itself. He taught his men not to trust, not to plan for the long haul. He taught them to strike first, bury questions later, and fear even their own shadows. So now, in the aftermath, the few remaining loyalists were broken men. Men who jumped at car doors slamming. Men who sat in diners with their backs to the wall. Men who never picked up unknown numbers and couldn't sleep without a gun on the nightstand, even though they hadn't been active in years. One of them, a former soldier named Benny Zangari, lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered pawn shop in South Jersey. He didn't talk to anyone anymore, just watched reruns and played solitaire on a table that used to count envelopes filled with thousands. His phone hadn't rung in days, but he kept it charged. He still remembered the last thing Scarfo ever said to him before going away. "Don't ever make the mistake of thinking you're safe. You're only safe as long as I say so." That voice never left. Benny once thought about writing a book, telling his side, spinning it into something profitable. But every time he sat at the keyboard, his hands shook too much to type. Some ghosts weren't worth poking, and Benny wasn't the only one. All across the East Coast, there were men who owed their survival to luck or betrayal. Some had flipped, some had faded, but none came out clean. Even Phil Leonetti, the prince who turned on the king, couldn't escape the shadow. He served 5 years, came out, got protection, new identity, new life. But deep down, he knew. Someone somewhere was always going to remember. You don't betray the man who taught you how to kill and expect forgiveness from the world, even if that man deserved it. Phil gave interviews later, talked about the killings, the fear, the cold, how Scarfo didn't hesitate, how ordering someone dead was like ordering takeout. But what he didn't talk about, not really, was the guilt, the late nights, the faces he couldn't forget. There was one time, he admitted, when he woke up screaming, dreamed of Salvi Testa, the look on the kid's face right before the bullets flew. That wasn't just a crew member, that was a friend. And he helped bury him. Phil said Scarfo made him do it. Scarfo's paranoia, Scarfo's rules. But that didn't matter when you're staring at a ceiling fan in the dark and your throat is dry from nightmares. No amount of witness protection erases that. The truth was, Scarfo infected every man he touched. They carried his madness long after he was gone. But the streets moved on. After Scarfo, there was a vacuum, and for a while, nobody knew who'd step into it. There were power grabs, quiet ones, meetings in basements, new faces trying to take old chairs. But none of them ruled like Scarfo, because none of them dared. The commission in New York had made it clear Philadelphia was not to become another war zone. Bloodshed brought heat, and heat meant indictments. So the new leadership took a different route, subtle, quiet, greedy, yes, but not suicidal. There were whispers of a reorganization, that the Philly mob was still active, still earning, but with smarter heads, fewer hits, more silence, unions still touched, some shylocking, construction deals, drugs, carefully. But no fireworks, no headlines. The city no longer feared the Mafia like it did in Scarfo's day. Now, it ignored it. And that was the final insult to Scarfo's memory. He hadn't just failed to build an empire, he built a tomb. Men who came after him had to start from scratch, rebuild relationships, fix reputations. The FBI had so many files on the Philly mob, they had to start storing them off-site. It would take a generation to dig out from under that kind of exposure. And while some tried, many just chose to move on. Organized crime still existed, of course, it always would. But it wasn't the same. It was slower, quieter, more corporate. Less bullets, more fraud. Less blood, more paper. And in that world, men like Scarfo had no place. There were still some old-timers who toasted to his name once a year in the back of some dingy club, whispering stories about when Philly meant something. But they were relics, remnants, like men worshiping a god who had long since burned his own church down. By the 2010s, even those whispers were fading. The young guys didn't want to be like Scarfo. They wanted to stay out of prison. They wanted to live. That was the real legacy Scarfo left behind. A generation that feared not death, but being remembered like him. A cautionary tale, a chapter in a documentary, a warning. Because Scarfo had it all, the money, the respect, the seat at the top of the table, and he burned it down with his own hands. He couldn't share power, he couldn't trust, he couldn't stop killing, and when you can't stop killing, eventually you run out of enemies and start making new ones out of your friends. By the end, there was no one left who would take his call. Not one man who would have visited his grave without wondering if they were next. The city of Philadelphia, for all its sins, eventually learned. But it learned the hard way, from the blood on the sidewalks, from the funerals without tears, from the man who ruled like Caesar and fell like a mad king with no army. Nicodemo Scarfo might have thought he was immortal, but all the bullets, all the fear, all the screams, none of it could stop the truth. He died the way he lived, alone. The ashes of Scarfo's reign didn't cool quickly. After the blood dried and the headlines faded, the question remained, who now? Who could fill a throne soaked in that much violence without ending up like the madman who ruled before? Philadelphia was broken. The crime family wasn't dead, not exactly, but it wasn't alive either. It was a body on life support, hooked up to whispers and half-hearted rackets, barely breathing. The structure was there, captains, soldiers, a few earners still collecting envelopes, but the soul had been ripped out. Scarfo had made sure of that. Most of the old-timers were either buried, locked up, or flipped. And the new blood? They weren't soldiers raised in the street. They were cautious, strategic. Some would say smarter, others would say soft, but one thing was certain, none of them wanted to be Scarfo. So the rebuilding began, quietly. At the center of the rebuilding was a man named Joseph Uncle Joe Ligambi. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, he wasn't Scarfo. And that's what made him perfect. Ligambi had done his time, spent years in the background. He wasn't feared like Scarfo, but he was respected. In the underworld, that counted for more. He didn't shoot first, he didn't bark orders, he moved slow. Like a man walking through a room full of broken glass, careful not to wake the ghosts. He took over the remains of the Philadelphia mob in the late 90s, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. He called himself a gentleman gangster, low profile, no unnecessary blood. Under his leadership, the family refocused on earning the old ways, gambling, loan sharking, a little labor muscle. No turf wars, no flashy headlines, just money. And that approach worked. For a while. The FBI called it the quietest era of Philly organized crime in decades. But peace doesn't make legends. It just delays war. Even with Ligambi at the top, there were still cracks. Some men wanted the old ways back. They missed the fear, the muscle, the respect that came when a name like Scarfo was spoken in hushed tones. They thought Ligambi was too soft, too corporate. And those thoughts grew into whispers. The whispers turned into meetings. Meetings turned into problems. One of those problems had a name, Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino. He wasn't quiet. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't built for background work. He was Scarfo's nightmare reborn, slick, fearless, and eager to be known. Merlino grew up watching the chaos. He saw the empire fall. He knew what unchecked power could do, but instead of learning restraint, he learned swagger. He wasn't scared of headlines. He liked them. He wore suits like a model, smiled in photos, gave interviews with just enough edge to sound dangerous without giving too much away. He was cool, and that made him dangerous. To the streets, he looked like the future. To the FBI, he looked like trouble. To Ligambi, he looked like the beginning of the end. By the early 2000s, tensions rose. Merlino had served time and come out hungry. He had loyalists, younger guys who didn't want to collect quiet envelopes. They wanted turf, respect, control, and they didn't want to answer to Ligambi anymore. It wasn't a civil war, not yet. But it was a cold one. Lines were drawn, but not spoken. Power moves were subtle. Some businesses stopped paying tribute. Some captains began shifting loyalty. Everyone smiled in public, but behind closed doors, the walls had ears and the floors had cracks. Merlino started making moves, not the kind Scarfo made with bullets and blood, but influence, presence. He started showing up, hosting dinners, appearing at events, letting the world know he was still Joey, and Joey wasn't done. The press loved it, the FBI even more. They called it the Scarfo cycle: violence, paranoia, rebuilding, ambition, then violence again. But Merlino wasn't Scarfo, not quite. He was smarter about it. He didn't order hits in broad daylight. He didn't clean house like a dictator. He was calculated, charming, dangerous. The kind of man who laughed with you while taking your chair. Behind the scenes, the FBI wasn't sleeping. They'd learned their lesson after Scarfo. You don't wait until the streets are red to start digging. They had surveillance on everyone. Bugs in phones, eyes in diners, trackers on cars. They knew Ligambi's operation was old school, but quiet. They knew Merlino was building something louder. And in 2011, they made their move. 14 men were indicted in what was called the most significant blow to the Philly mob since Scarfo's era. RICO charges again, the same net. Gambling, extortion, loans, wire fraud. Nothing bloody, just enough to cause noise. Ligambi was swept up in it. But unlike Scarfo, Ligambi didn't crumble under the heat. He fought it, kept his mouth shut, faced the charges like a man with nothing to lose. He beat the case, walked free in 2014 after 2 mistrials. No conviction, no flip. He went home. Merlino, though, saw it differently. The charges made him cautious. He moved to Florida, started running things from afar, allegedly. He opened a restaurant, played golf, lived like a semi-retired wise guy with one foot still in the shadows. But nobody believed he was out. Not really. Not when his name still carried weight, not when his number still lit up phones in South Philly. Back home, the Philly mob entered a new era. Not one of violence, not one of peace, one of quiet uncertainty. The men at the table had changed. The rules were looser. The money wasn't as thick. But the game, still the same. Loyalty was still currency. Disrespect still cost you, and silence was still survival. The streets remembered Scarfo, but not with fear, with a kind of disbelief, like a fever dream that nearly killed the patient. New players didn't want to be like him. They wanted to last, to make money, not headlines, to be whispers, not stories. But the question lingered. Can the mob survive without fear? Without a man willing to rule through pure force? Ligambi had shown you could survive with respect. Merlino wanted both, respect and fear. But the younger guys? They just wanted to eat. No wars, no funerals, just clean money and quiet weeks. And that shift, that slow, grinding shift, is what defined the post-Scarfo era. It wasn't better. It wasn't worse. It was different. The rules changed. The players adjusted. But the game, still on. There's a table in South Philly. They don't meet often. Not like before. But when they do, the air still gets heavy. The suits still straighten their collars. The voices get quiet. Because the ghosts never really leave. Scarfo, Bruno, Testa, all of them. And whether they admit it or not, every man in that room, every earner, every captain, every underboss, still measures their own power against the shadows of those who came before. They know what happened, they know what Scarfo did, and they know what it cost. The shadow of Nicodemo Scarfo was never meant to last, not this long. But that's what happens when a man uses fear as a tool and blood as ink. He doesn't just stain the men who followed him, he stains the map itself. Streets that once ran wet with the aftermath of his decisions still carried the tension in their cracks. Bars he used to frequent felt colder. Restaurants that once hosted whispers never felt quiet again. The new men walked through his ghost like fog. They didn't say his name aloud, not unless they had to. Some pretended not to remember. Others refused to forget. But everyone felt him. He was still there, watching the changes from 6 feet deep. It was a younger man now handling most of the street business. He wasn't made in the way the old school used to do it, with solemn oaths, candles, and knives pricking skin, but he was trusted enough to move money, collect debts, and hold conversations that could shift territory. His name was Anthony D'Angelo. Late 30s, clean record, smart mouth, quiet fists. He didn't come up during Scarfo's time, but his father did. His father never talked about it, only mentioned a Nicky once, and it was like a growl ripped through the room. That was enough. Anthony knew better than to follow in those footsteps. He didn't shoot unless he had to. He didn't raise his voice. He made deals, made people feel like they were still important even when they weren't. But power, that was his endgame. And lately, the streets had been whispering his name like it meant something again. He moved differently from the old generation. No flashy suits, no cigars, no big Sunday dinners with 20 guys packing heat under their jackets. Anthony worked in logistics, the legal kind. Moved goods through front companies, real trucks, real goods, real invoices. But tucked inside those shipments were packages that never showed up on customs reports. That's where the money was now, not in bullets, but in boxes. He had friends in Jersey, muscle in Delaware, and a quiet understanding with some Cubans out of Miami who owed him favors. Every week, more envelopes came in, cleaner money, less violent. But still mob money, and that brought attention. The wrong kind. An old capo, Frankie Troiani, wasn't a fan of Anthony. Frankie was 62, built like a cracked tree stump, and carried a sour expression like it was stitched into his face. He'd been with the family since the 80s, made his bones under Scarfo, survived the fallout, did time, and came back meaner. To him, Anthony was soft, all talk, too clean. He didn't like how the younger guys followed him like puppies. Didn't like how he'd never had to pull a body out of a trunk at 3 a.m. in freezing rain. And he hated, truly hated, that Anthony was starting to get invited to the table. The table was sacred to Frankie. It had blood on it. It had history. He remembered when sitting there meant you had ghosts to your name. He didn't want some clean-faced kid showing up with iPad spreadsheets and acting like he understood the life. So Frankie started talking. Not loud, but enough. At first, it was subtle. Kid doesn't know the old ways. Never seen him raise a hand in his life. Bet he couldn't stomach what it really takes. Anthony heard the echoes. He didn't respond. That was his move. Always was. Let them talk. Let them try to define you while they're still playing checkers and you're working the chessboard. But he knew something was coming. Frankie was too bitter to just spit words and let it go. Men like him never just complain. They maneuver. And sure enough, a few weeks later, Anthony got a quiet tip. A sit-down was happening. Not official, not full council. Just a few old names, and Frankie was at the center. Word was, they were discussing a realignment of street responsibilities. That meant cuts, territory, who answered to who. And Anthony wasn't on the guest list. That told him everything. He didn't panic. He doubled down. He called Vinny Merlino, one of the younger earners, mid-40s, sharp eyes, with a reputation for being loyal to whoever paid on time. Anthony had helped Vinny clear a gambling debt last year, bailed out his younger brother when some Albanians got heavy with him. It wasn't forgotten. They met at a little seafood spot in South Philly. Low lighting, nothing fancy, real locals only. Anthony didn't waste time. I hear Frankie wants to cut me out. Vinny kept his eyes on the plate. I heard the same. Anthony sipped his drink. I let it go. It sets a tone. They'll come for my whole slice. Vinny nodded slowly. What's the move? Anthony leaned back. Let 'em talk. Let 'em meet. Just make sure I know where they're sitting. Vinny cracked a small smile. "You going loud?" Anthony shook his head. "No, I'm not Scarfo. I don't need to paint the walls. I just need them to understand the balance again." Two weeks later, Frankie's sit-down took place at a private room behind an old pool hall on Oregon Avenue. 4 men, all old names. 2 of them still had bullet scars from the Scarfo era. 1 walked with a limp. The meeting was calm. They spoke about percentages, respect, about how the younger guys weren't doing things the right way anymore, about how things had to be realigned, whatever that meant. But halfway through the meeting, something strange happened. A phone buzzed on the table. Frankie picked it up. His face went pale. He didn't say what he saw, just stood up, excused himself. The other men stayed, confused, nervous. Frankie stepped outside. Across the street, parked at the corner, a black Lincoln sat idle. Inside it, the same Albanian crew that Anthony had bailed Vinny out from last year, only now they were on his payroll. They didn't move. Didn't need to. Frankie stared for a full minute. Then he turned and left. The message was clear. Anthony didn't need to shoot to win. He just needed you to remember that he could. A week later, the realignment talks stopped. Nobody said why. Frankie kept his mouth shut, didn't apologize, but he didn't show up to the next table meet either. Rumor was he'd been told to take a break, travel, see family. Anthony wasn't happy. He wasn't proud, but he was in. And from that point forward, the new generation of the Philadelphia mob began to look different. Not weaker, just evolved. No more Scarfo-style purges. No more egos carving territory out of fear. Now it was about money, about leverage, about knowing which pressure point to touch and when. Anthony understood that, and because he understood it, he survived. One night, months later, Anthony sat in the back of a bar with Vinny and a few others. Just drinks, low chatter, nothing big. Someone brought up Scarfo again, one of the young guys, just a dumb joke. Something about how things were different now. Anthony didn't laugh. He leaned in close and said, "That man bled this city. Every corner, every block. You walk clean now because others didn't." The room went quiet. Anthony finished his drink, stood up, walked out. He didn't hate Scarfo. He didn't admire him either, but he respected the scar he left behind, because that scar taught everyone a lesson. And Anthony, he was making damn sure it didn't have to be repeated. The city had gone too quiet, not peaceful, just quiet, like the pause before a storm. The kind of silence that didn't soothe, but warned. Anthony D'Angelo had earned his seat not through bloodshed, but by knowing when to press and when to lean back. He was the new face, the future of Philly's rebuilt underworld, the kind of man who used leverage like a scalpel and let the streets speak for him. But what men like Anthony forget, what all men forget when things get too calm, is that quiet breeds envy. And envy, that's what always breaks the circle. It started with a man named Tommy Ferrara, older, tough, did real time back in the early 90s. He was old Scarfo stock, not from the core inner circle, but close enough to smell the gunpowder when bodies dropped. He kept his mouth shut back then, like a man was supposed to. Came out of prison with no deals, no papers, and no regrets. And that made him dangerous. Men like Tommy didn't forget, especially not when they came home to a new order. Younger guys running things, rules changed, names changed, and he wasn't part of any of it. He sat on the sidelines for a while, smiling through gritted teeth, watching Anthony rise, watching envelopes go to men he didn't respect, watching the legacy of the old ways get boxed up and replaced by smooth talk and front companies. It ate at him, slow, quiet, like rust under a Cadillac. Tommy didn't come at Anthony head on. He wasn't stupid. Anthony had backing. Vinny, the Jersey crews, pieces of New York. He couldn't fight that, not without getting buried. But he knew how to move. He started with Sal Sorelli, a loan shark who'd been floating on the edge for years. Sal owed to everyone. He played all sides, didn't carry heat, didn't command loyalty. But he had ears everywhere, and more importantly, he had access. He worked closely with Luca Grimaldi, one of Anthony's newer earners, a guy in his early 30s who ran the poker rooms out in the Northeast. Fast cars, fast mouth, and not a shred of the old school in him. Luca made money, but he also liked to talk. Tommy saw his angle. All he had to do was push the right rumor into the right room and sit back. It started small. A whisper about Anthony taking more than his cut from a sports betting joint in West Philly. Then a story about how one of Anthony's guys leaned too hard on a local contractor who was supposedly protected. And finally, a carefully crafted lie that Anthony was talking directly to someone in the Eastern District's office, that he was protecting himself. That one stuck. Because in this life, the only thing worse than being feared is being suspected of cooperation. The streets didn't react fast. It never does. But the looks started changing. Conversations stopped when Anthony entered rooms. Guys he used to shake hands with started texting instead. And Luca, he started asking questions to the wrong people. And Tommy, he just watched. Anthony felt it before he heard it. One afternoon, he was sitting in the back of a cafe on Passyunk, sipping espresso with Vinnie Merlino and a guy from the Bronx named Carl C-Note Latanzi, a connect from the old Fat Tony days. They were talking quiet business, real estate stuff, nothing flashy. But Vinnie wasn't himself, kept checking his phone, eyes darting around like a man watching shadows stretch. Anthony finally leaned in and said, "You gonna tell me, or should I guess?" Vinnie hesitated, then said, "They're saying you're talking?" Anthony didn't flinch. "To who?" Vinnie looked down. "Doesn't matter. The name don't matter. The idea's out." Carl sat back and muttered, "That's poison, Ant, even if it ain't true." Anthony nodded slowly. "I know who started it." Vinnie didn't ask, because they both knew. Tommy Ferrara was the kind of man who didn't talk fast, but everything he said got picked up like gospel by the old guys who still thought Scarfo got it right. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about legacy. And Tommy wanted to restore something Anthony thought was already buried. That night, Anthony didn't sleep. He didn't panic either. He just lay there in the dark, listening to the silence press in like a weight on his chest. He'd come up avoiding this exact moment, the one where power shifts from quiet efficiency to cold survival. The moment when logic stops mattering, when truth means nothing. Only perception. He couldn't afford to wait, not now. He called Vinnie just past 2 a.m. "We need to shut this down." Vinnie didn't ask how. Anthony already had the play in motion. The next day, Luca Grimaldi disappeared. No warning, no message. His car was found parked outside a strip mall in Cherry Hill. Engine still warm, wallet still in the front seat, phone gone. He wasn't dead, not yet, but he was gone. And everyone in the life knew what that meant. It wasn't just a disappearance, it was a warning. It meant, stop talking or you're next. Within 24 hours, the whispers shifted. Nobody could confirm what happened to Luca. Nobody saw who took him. But the timing was clear. The accusations against Anthony stopped being spoken out loud. Sal Sorelli skipped town. And Tommy? He didn't leave. But he stopped smiling. The move was surgical, controlled, measured, exactly how Anthony wanted it. But that kind of silence doesn't erase everything. It just buys time. The city still held its breath, because something had been broken, not Anthony's power, but the illusion of calm that had kept the newer generation from turning on each other. Now they knew. If Anthony could make Luca disappear, he could do it to any of them. And that kind of knowledge, it creates loyalty, but the wrong kind, not the respect-based loyalty that Legambi used to maintain order. This was fear, and fear, no matter how controlled, always leaks. 2 weeks later, Anthony went to Mass at a small church his mother used to drag him to as a boy. He didn't go for God. He went because the quiet inside the old stone walls reminded him of who he was before all of this. He sat in the back pew, alone. Nobody noticed him. Nobody cared. He watched the priest light candles, watched the flicker. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered what it meant to have a name like his, to be part of something that couldn't love you back. The life didn't forgive, didn't reward. It just waited for weakness, for one wrong move, for silence to turn into a grave. He knew the clock was ticking. He just didn't know when it would stop. The city had changed since Scarfo's reign, on the surface anyway. The new skyline didn't carry blood like the old streets did. Coffee shops sat where numbers joints used to run. Half the bars that once echoed with whispers now streamed college games and served overpriced wings. But behind all that, beneath the clean sidewalks and polished storefronts, the same eyes watched, the same games were played, and the same old sins festered, just dressed in cleaner suits. And for Anthony D'Angelo, that silence had begun to feel like a noose. He thought the Luca Grimaldi disappearance had bought him breathing room. It didn't. It just made people remember something that had been buried a long time. What happened the last time a man ruled with fear. It started with a knock on his door, not his house, too personal, but his office. A small space on the second floor of a property management firm that fronted half of his real estate laundering. He was alone. No security that day. Vinny was checking a warehouse across the bridge. Anthony liked moments like this. Unguarded, quiet, real. Until the knock. 3 slow taps, then silence. He opened the door and found an old man in a gray coat. Balding, gaunt, eyes too sharp for his age. He smelled like damp books and winter breath. But something about him, something Anthony couldn't put a name to, felt off. The man stepped in without being invited, walked past him like he owned the floor. "You don't remember me," the man said, voice steady. "But I knew your father." Anthony shut the door, locked it. "You got a name?" The man smiled. "Johnny Costa. They used to call me Johnny the Crutch." Anthony knew the name. Everyone who grew up around the life had heard it. Johnny was old Scarfo era, ran crews out of Trenton, disappeared after '86 when the indictments started rolling. Rumor said he fled to Sicily. Others claimed he flipped and disappeared into witness protection. Nobody really knew, and nobody really asked. Until now. "I came to pay a debt," Gianni said, settling into a chair like a man who never left the game. "To your father, not to you." Anthony didn't answer. Gianni kept talking. "Your father spared me once. Scarfo wanted me clipped, said I was skimming off a shipment from Atlantic City. Your father vouched for me. Bought me time." Anthony said nothing. His father had died 10 years ago, cancer eating him slowly in a hospice bed, while Anthony sat by, wondering if the man ever felt sorry for the life he passed down. Johnny leaned forward. "I've got something. Old, ugly, but it's yours now." Anthony finally broke his silence. "Why now?" Johnny smiled. "Because your enemies don't forget the blood that built this city, and they just dug up some of it." He slid an envelope across the desk. Anthony didn't touch it. Johnny stood up, straightened his coat. "They're not trying to take your seat, Anthony. They're trying to rewrite the board. Scarfo was the end, but someone out there wants to make him the beginning again." And then, like a ghost, he was gone. Anthony opened the envelope only after Gianni had been gone 20 minutes. Inside were 2 photographs, old and faded. The first was of a man, early 40s, smiling, arms around 2 younger men, one of them unmistakably Scarfo. The second man? Anthony's father. The second photo showed a different scene. 3 men kneeling on concrete, hands tied behind their backs, mouths gagged, faces swollen, and in the background, standing in shadow, but unmistakable in posture, was a 4th man, holding what looked like a crowbar. The face was grainy. But the jacket? It was the same one worn by Frankie Troiani, the bitter old capo Anthony had outmaneuvered months ago. The message was clear. Frankie wasn't just bitter, he was building something old, something that reeked of Scarfo's era. Anthony didn't panic. He thought, hard. Frankie had history. He had old connections. He'd survived 2 internal purges, sat across the table from bosses who were now bones. Men like him didn't come at you with bullets anymore. They came with memory. They didn't want to kill you. They wanted to replace you. And this wasn't about Anthony being weak. It was about Frankie believing he could rebuild the past, bring back the old code, the old brutality, the kind of rule that didn't tolerate half measures or spreadsheets or diplomacy. Anthony stood by the window, watching the city flicker below him, and understood one thing clearly. This wasn't politics anymore. It was war. The old versus the new. Blood versus strategy. Scarfo's shadow was moving again. Vinnie Merlino showed up an hour later, face pale from cold, eyes sunken. He didn't say a word. Anthony slid the photos across the desk. Vinnie stared at them for a long time. Then he said, "That's the basement under the Union Hall on 10th. How sure?" 100%. Anthony lit a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in over a year. "Frankie's making plays with old ghosts," Vinnie muttered, "trying to pull soldiers out of retirement. I heard he's been talking to a guy upstate, Marco Polini. Name ring a bell?" Anthony nodded. Polini was old Scarfo muscle. Took a plea in '88, did 20 flat, came out in 2009 and kept his head down. But lately, he'd been spotted at a few backroom dinners, quietly. "You think he's building something?" Vinnie nodded. "Worse, I think he already built it." The next week was spent in the dark. Anthony didn't make any public moves. No meetings, no sit-downs, no calls. He knew better than to look panicked, but behind the scenes, he mapped every piece of Frankie's growing faction. 3 old capos, 1 active crew in South Jersey, and 1 former Bruno family associate who disappeared for a decade and was now quietly running an import business out of the port. It wasn't just a faction. It was a parallel operation, not active, not yet, but it had all the bones of something ready to move. And if Frankie really had old dirt, old bodies tied to Anthony's father, then it wasn't just business. It was legacy warfare. Anthony met with Gianni Costa again in an underground parking lot 2 nights later. No guards, no surveillance, just cold air and unfinished sentences. "I gave you the warning," Gianni said, hands in his coat. "I need more," Anthony replied. Gianni shook his head. "I'm done with all that." "You sure?" Anthony asked. "Because if you walk now and this goes sideways, the wrong men come out of this." Gianni looked at him tired. "Let me give you something." Anthony waited. Johnny leaned in. "There's a book. Scarfo kept it. Not like a ledger. More like a memory dump. Names, orders, who gave what nod. Your old man was in it." Anthony's jaw tightened. "Where is it?" Johnny shrugged. "Frankie's looking for it too. If he finds it first..." Anthony didn't need the sentence finished. He already knew. That book wasn't just proof. It was a crown. Back at his apartment that night, Anthony sat alone on the balcony, city buzzing beneath him, and flipped through every move he'd made in the last 6 months. Every ally, every favor, every enemy left alive. And he realized something no one ever teaches you in this life. Sometimes survival isn't about strength, it's about timing. Scarfo had ruled with timing. He struck when men thought he was weakest. And now, Anthony was about to do the same, but not with bullets, with truth. He wasn't going to bury Frankie. He was going to expose him, burn the past so completely no one would want to rebuild it, and he knew exactly where to start. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. But it wasn't guns in alleys or bodies in trunks this time. It was quieter, colder. A battle being fought with whispers, old photos, and the slow reawakening of a legacy that should have stayed buried with Nicodemo Scarfo. Anthony D'Angelo knew Frankie Troiani wasn't just trying to cut him out. He was trying to resurrect a version of the mob that Anthony had spent his entire life outmaneuvering. A version that ruled with fear, paranoia, and the false belief that blood buys loyalty. But Anthony wasn't built like Scarfo. He wasn't scared of violence. He just didn't waste it. And now, he wasn't going to swing wild. He was going to go for the throat. And to do that, he needed the one thing that could rewrite history: Scarfo's ledger. The rumors about this book had always existed. Some said Scarfo kept detailed records of everyone he ever had killed, not for legal use, but as insurance. Others said it was more like a journal: thoughts, decisions, names scribbled in rage or paranoia, written in a way only he could understand. But according to Gianni Costa, it was real. And if Frankie got his hands on it, he could burn Anthony down with whatever was inside about his father. But if Anthony found it first, he could control the narrative. And in this life, narrative was everything. Anthony started where Gianni had left him, a warehouse in Port Richmond that used to be a mob-run meat distribution facility in the 80s. Back then, it was a known hangout spot for mid-level guys, a place where blood wasn't spilled. But orders were. The building had long since been sold to a shell company. Anthony had Vinny pull the records. The name on the current lease: Cobalt Atlantic Shipping LLC, a front loosely connected to a South Jersey trucking outfit that once paid tribute to the Bruno family. Anthony knew it on sight. This wasn't Frankie's. This was Pellini's turf. Marco Pellini, the old Scarfo enforcer who'd vanished into quiet post-prison obscurity. Everyone assumed he'd gone soft after doing his time. Turns out, he'd just been waiting. The next night, Anthony and Vinny made their move. It was close to 3 a.m. when they broke in. No alarms, just old locks and heavy rust. The place stank of dust, rot, and neglect, but something in the air still felt heavy, like memories were trapped inside. They moved through the building slow, room by room, flashlights cutting through the dark. And then they found it. A locked freezer door in the back, the kind they used in the old days, with triple latches and an insulated core. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Vinny picked the lock with a quiet curse. This better not be a wild goose chase. Anthony didn't respond. When the door creaked open, the air that came out was dry and stale. No cold, just dead silence. Inside, stacked along the walls, were wooden crates. They cracked the first open. Files, photos, old gambling slips, surveillance shots. Another box held handwritten notes, ledgers from the early 80s. Every page listed amounts, names, debts paid and unpaid. And then, the last crate in the far corner. A weather-worn black binder, cracked leather, no label, just thick pages and a thin strap holding it shut. Anthony took a breath before opening it. The first few pages were messy, frantic handwriting, barely legible, like Scarfo had written them in bursts, paranoid, sweating, convinced he was being watched even as he recorded his thoughts. But the deeper Anthony flipped, the clearer the writing became. And the content? Brutal. It wasn't a ledger. It was a manifesto. Scarfo had written about everyone, not just his enemies, but his friends, his suspicions, his plans, his rage. Paragraphs of accusations, breakdowns of who he thought might betray him, who he wanted dead, who he thought deserved power, and who didn't. And on page 49, circled in red ink, was Anthony's father's name. Vince D'Angelo, loyal for now, watching him. I think he spoke to Bruno once before the Testa hit. Might be soft, could be a problem. Vinny read over Anthony's shoulder and muttered, "Damn, that's not good." But Anthony kept flipping. Because 3 pages later, under a scrawl titled "Corrected Trust," Scarfo had written something different. Vince proved himself, took care of it, removed the witness, reliable. More like me than I thought. Vinny looked at Anthony. "You think that's what Frankie's after? That first page?" Anthony nodded. "He only needs the first one. That's the dagger. He won't care about the rest." Vinny asked, "What do we do with it?" Anthony closed the book slowly. "We rewrite the rules." The next morning, Anthony made a move no one saw coming. He sent a scanned copy of both Scarfo pages, the accusation and the correction, to 3 of the city's most influential old-school earners, men who had sat across from Scarfo, men who once feared Frankie Troiani, but had no love for the chaos he was now stirring up. He included no explanation, just the words, "Read carefully. Don't be used." Within 24 hours, the streets started shifting. Two of Frankie's allies canceled a planned dinner meeting. One of them, a capo named Sal Lamonaco, reportedly told a mutual friend, "If Scarfo changed his mind, I'm not risking my name on Frankie's nostalgia." The momentum Frankie had been quietly building began to slip, and Anthony, he wasn't done. He arranged a sit-down, neutral ground, a union hall in Fishtown, no weapons, just voices. Frankie showed up, flanked by Polini and a young soldier from South Jersey who looked more nervous than dangerous. Anthony came alone. Vinny was parked 2 blocks away in a van, watching, just in case. Frankie walked in like a man who still believed in myth, like Scarfo's ghost had handed him a sword instead of a shackle. He didn't sit. "I know what you're doing," he said coldly. Anthony didn't raise his voice. "What I'm doing is stopping you from dragging us all back into a nightmare," Frankie laughed. "Nightmare? You call what you're running now a dream?" Anthony stood, moved slow, controlled. "No, but it's not blood-soaked paranoia. You're building a ghost town, Frankie. Chasing a king that already died in prison." Frankie stepped forward. "You're not him. You're not your father." Anthony looked him dead in the eye. And thank God for that, because my father had to stand next to a monster and pretend it made him safe. "I'm not pretending." He pulled a folder from his coat, dropped it on the table. "The book's real. The pages about him are in there, both of them. You keep pushing this war. I'll drop the full copy in front of the commission. Let them read what Scarfo thought of you." Frankie stared at him, eyes flat. But behind them, something cracked. Anthony leaned in. "This isn't about fear anymore, Frankie. It's about survival. And right now, you're bleeding out and too proud to admit it." Frankie didn't respond. Not directly. But 3 days later, Polini withdrew from a planned expansion deal in Camden, and the soldier from South Jersey stopped answering Frankie's calls. The old structure, the one built on blood and legend, had finally started to collapse under the weight of its own myth. And Anthony? He didn't celebrate. He just returned the book to a safe built behind the drywall of his private office, locked it, and walked away. Because now, the real work began. Scarfo's book wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a reminder of what not to become, of what kind of man not to be. And Anthony knew he wasn't done dodging ghosts. They were still out there, waiting. But next time, he wouldn't be chasing the past. He'd be burying it. For good. Anthony D'Angelo didn't trust suits. Never had. He didn't wear them unless he had to. And even then, it felt like wrapping himself in something he wasn't. Suits were for the guys who played politics, who shook hands with knives hidden behind their backs, who smiled while calculating body counts. And the man who walked into his office wearing a charcoal Armani, gold cufflinks, and Italian leather shoes, he was nothing but danger. He said his name was Dominic Ferrara, New York accent, controlled smile, age hard to guess, somewhere between 50 and 60. He had the kind of face that stayed smooth while cities burned. Anthony didn't stand up when he entered. Dominic didn't seem to mind. He sat down like he'd been there 100 times before. "I'm here on behalf of the commission," he said, crossing one leg over the other. "Specifically, the Genovese and Gambino interests. They've been watching. They don't like what they've been hearing." Anthony folded his hands. "You flew down to give me street gossip?" Dominic smirked. "I flew down because names are being whispered that should have stayed buried. Scarfo, Bruno, Troiani. That kind of chatter makes New York nervous." Anthony didn't blink. "Philly handles its own." "That's the problem," Dominic replied. "Philly hasn't handled anything clean since Bruno got clipped, and now you've got half the city reading Scarfo's journal like it's gospel." Anthony's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "That wasn't my intention." Dominic leaned forward. "Doesn't matter. It's done. And now you've got choices to make." That word, choices, hung in the room like smoke. Because when New York offered you choices, what they really meant was, this is what you're going to do, and we're giving you the illusion of freedom. Anthony had been bracing for something like this since the moment the ledger came out. Frankie Troiani was finished, but his noise had reached far. And the commission? They never missed a good excuse to tighten their grip. Dominic reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder. He slid it across the table. Anthony opened it. Inside were two documents. One was a transfer of oversight. If Anthony signed it, he'd agree to bring his street operations under consultative guidance from the Genovese family. Specifically, a 3-man board that would review and advise on all territory disputes, expansions, and collections. It was oversight without calling it takeover. The second was a partnership agreement. An invitation, or an order, to allow a Gambino-connected front to open a joint venture in South Jersey. A new operation with full access to unions, docks, and infrastructure. The deal would benefit both families. In other words, New York was planting flags, and they wanted Anthony to roll out the carpet. He closed the folder slowly. Dominic gave him a knowing smile. You're smart. You know how this goes. You play along, you get backing, you get insulation, and maybe down the line a bigger seat at the table, Anthony replied. And if I don't? Dominic didn't flinch. Then someone else gets the seat. Maybe Vinny, maybe one of Frankie's leftovers. Doesn't matter. The wheel turns with or without you. Anthony looked him dead in the eye. That a threat? Dominic grinned. That's gravity. After Dominic left, Anthony didn't move for a while. The office was quiet, but his head wasn't. He had fought too long, played too careful, buried too many ghosts to hand over the reins to men who didn't bleed on Philly's sidewalks. And yet, refusing New York wasn't just brave. It was suicidal. They wouldn't come with bullets. They'd come with doubt, rumors, arrests, maybe even a body or two, just to remind people that resistance still had consequences. He lit a cigarette and stared out the window, wondering if this was what his father had felt when Scarfo gave him an order he didn't agree with. That same slow-burning dread of knowing you either play the part or end up in the ground. He met Vinny that night at a closed bar off Front Street. Vinny read the documents in silence. When he looked up, he didn't ask what they meant. He already knew. They're not offering help, he muttered. They're cutting pieces off us. Anthony nodded. Vinny looked at him. So, what's the move? Anthony leaned back. I need a meeting, not with Dominic, with Sal Marchetto. Vinny raised a brow. Sal's Gambino hierarchy. You think he'll talk behind Dominic's back? I don't want to talk behind Dominic's back. I want to talk in front of his face. Vinny looked confused. I don't follow. Anthony crushed his cigarette in the ashtray. We're not going to fight New York. We're going to make them argue with themselves. Sal Marchetto was old-school Gambino, not flashy, not sloppy. Ran construction rackets and import-export out of Brooklyn. He was cautious but respected. More importantly, he didn't trust Dominic Ferrara. Anthony had heard whispers, territory disputes in North Jersey, Dominic backing too many rising stars. Quiet accusations that he was spreading Genovese influence without the full backing of the commission. Sal didn't like that, and Anthony, he planned to exploit it. The meeting took place in an Italian restaurant in Staten Island, closed for plumbing issues that night. 3 men total, Anthony, Vinny, and Sal. Dominic wasn't there. That was the point. Anthony didn't dress like a boss. No suit, just a jacket and shirt. He came in like a man with nothing to prove, but everything on the line. Sal poured the wine. Didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just watched. Finally he said, "You came to make noise." Anthony shook his head. "I came to stop a lie." Sal raised a brow. Anthony opened the folder, showed him the Scarfo pages, explained what Frankie tried to do, then what Dominic came to collect. Sal didn't blink, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You know how many cities would kill for a boss who doesn't make messes?" he said finally. Anthony nodded. Then tell me why I'm being asked to hand the keys over to someone who only wants to dig up bones and call it structure." Sal sat back, sipped his wine. "You make your case to the commission directly. I'll get you in that room, one shot. But if they vote against you, there's no second chance." Anthony didn't hesitate. "I only need one." 3 weeks later, Anthony stood in front of 5 men, all of them older than him, all of them with more bodies behind them than most crime novels could handle. New York's 5 families, the commission. He laid out his case, clean, clear, no emotion, no speeches, just facts. Scarfo's ghost, Frankie's agenda, Dominic's power grab. He offered them a third path, allow Philly to retain independence, but agree to biannual reporting to the commission, no interference unless requested, and profit shares from Philly's port expansions split evenly. In return, no planting, no shadow governance, and one guarantee, no more Scarfo echoes. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then one of the bosses, an old man from the Lucchese family with dead eyes and a voice like gravel, spoke. "Let the kid have his rope. He either builds something or hangs himself with it." The others agreed. Unanimous. No handshake, just nods. And with that, Anthony won. When Dominic Ferrara got the news, he didn't speak, just poured himself a drink. He'd misplayed the board, and Anthony D'Angelo, he wasn't just some local boss anymore. He was now a recognized name, independent under the flag. Philly wasn't on its knees. It was standing taller than ever. And Scarfo, he was finally dead, not just in body, but in legend. The city had moved on. Victory doesn't feel like celebration in this life. It feels like a tighter grip. Anthony D'Angelo had survived the impossible, pushed back a New York power grab, exposed Frankie Troiani's attempted coup, and buried Scarfo's ghost once and for all. He'd walked into a commission meeting and come out with something no Philly boss had held in decades: autonomy. But autonomy doesn't mean immunity. It means every eye is now watching. New York wanted to see what he'd do with freedom. His own people wanted to see if he could hold on to it. And someone was already planning to take it away. It started with a phone call from a guy Anthony hadn't heard from in years. Tony "Twitch" Giordano, a mid-level earner who used to run poker clubs under Vinnie Merlino in the early 2010s. Twitch was never a major player. He was quick with his hands, quicker with his mouth, and always 2 steps from screwing something up. But he was loyal, or at least, that's what everyone thought. His voice on the phone was dry, nervous. "Ant, I need 5 minutes. Not over the phone." Anthony almost hung up, but something in Twitch's voice stopped him. It wasn't fear, it was regret. They met that night in a junkyard off Delaware Avenue, surrounded by rusted cars and silence. Twitch looked older than he should have, like someone who'd seen too much without understanding half of it. He didn't waste time. "I've been running numbers with a guy from Camden," he said, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Thought it was clean. Then I heard your name come up." Anthony stayed quiet. Twitch continued. "Guy said your piece in Jersey ain't gonna last. Said someone's moving in, real quiet. Real surgical. They're waiting for you to relax." Anthony narrowed his eyes. "Who's the guy?" Twitch swallowed. "Didn't say. But the name they mentioned? Vinny." That name hit harder than expected. Vinnie Merlino. Anthony's right hand, his oldest friend, the man who stood by him through every ghost, every betrayal, every storm. It didn't make sense. Unless it did. Anthony didn't respond. Just turned, walked back to his car, and left Twitch standing in the junkyard alone. He didn't trust Twitch, not completely, but he also didn't ignore whispers, especially not ones that echoed too clearly. Back in his office, Anthony started pulling old logs, phone records, meeting notes, movement logs from his Camden cruise. For weeks now, some things had been off. A shipment that got delayed without notice, a drop location switched at the last minute. A rival crew suddenly backing off a corner they'd been fighting over. At the time, Anthony chalked it up to good fortune. now. It smelled like calculated chaos, and the only man who had the access to orchestrate it without raising flags was Vinny. Anthony didn't go to him, not yet. Instead, he followed him. For 5 nights in a row, Anthony had a quiet tale on Vinny. 2 kids from North Philly, loyal only to cash and silence. They tracked Vinny from his house to the docks, from the docks to the back of a union hall, and from there to a club in Cherry Hill that hadn't been on anyone's radar in years. The club was called Dolce's. In the Scarfo era, it was known for 2 things: money laundering and quiet meetings that ended in loud violence. Now, apparently, it was being used again, and Vinny was there, twice, meeting with a man named Dominic Ferrara. Anthony didn't sleep that night, not out of shock, but out of disgust. Dominic, the Genovese rep who tried to muscle in weeks ago, who got pushed back by Anthony's diplomacy and grit, was now using his best friend to dig back in. And Vinny, he was smiling in the surveillance photos, laughing with Dominic, sitting like the seat across from him belonged to him all along. That betrayal, it didn't sting. It burned. The next day, Anthony called a meeting at a closed-down cafe on 7th. No one knew who the meeting was with. Vinny arrived first, casual, loose, like it was any other day. Anthony was already seated. No smile, no handshake, just silence. Vinny sat down slowly. "What's up?" Anthony slid the photos across the table. Vinny didn't even blink, which meant one thing: it was real. He knew he'd been made, and he wasn't sorry. "You think you got it figured out," Vinny said, voice low. "But you're running on borrowed time. You think New York's just gonna let you sit pretty? That they're not gonna come back eventually?" Anthony didn't speak. "You got 1 win, 1 meeting. That ain't power, Ant. That's luck. Dominic knows the game. You're just playing defense." Anthony stared at him. "You went behind my back." Vinny nodded. "Yeah, I did. Because I'm not going down when this thing falls apart. You built it too clean. You think blood don't stick. But this life? It always circles back." Anthony leaned forward, voice cold. "You done talking?" Vinny smirked. "Depends. You gonna kill me here? Or later?" Anthony stood up, walked out without a word. He didn't need to kill Vinny, not yet. He needed to make an example, one that would echo louder than a gunshot. Because this was deeper than betrayal. This was a warning shot from the past. The idea that loyalty was just temporary, that anyone could be flipped if the numbers were right, that Scarfo's disease, the paranoia, the distrust, the instinct to destroy what you built, wasn't gone. It was just sleeping. And Vinny had fed it. The next 72 hours were precise. Anthony moved fast. He cut Vinny out of all known operations quietly, froze assets, took over control of the Camden ports under the pretense of security updates. Then he reached out to Sal Marchetto again, the Gambino rep who had helped him stand up to Dominic once before. He told Sal everything. Vinny's meetings, Dominic's second move. Sal wasn't surprised. "Dominic's making a play for Jersey now," Sal said. "He's trying to make Philly look unstable so he can split Camden off and run it under a Genovese crew." Anthony asked, "You letting that happen?" Sal sipped his drink. "You get rid of Vinny without making a mess. I'll make sure Dominic gets a reminder of where his territory ends." That night, Anthony made the call, not to kill Vinny, but to send him away. Forever. He called Vinny to a construction site they used for quiet deals. When Vinny showed 2 of Anthony's guys, tight-lipped, clean hands, no affiliations to any old crews, were waiting. They didn't hit him, didn't even raise their voices. They handed him a one-way ticket to Las Vegas, gave him a duffel bag of cash, a burner phone with 1 contact saved. "Don't." Anthony stood across from him, hands in his coat. "You don't come back, you don't call anyone. You don't try and build anything out there. You breathe. That's all you get." Vinny didn't beg. He didn't argue. He just nodded and walked into the dark. Back at the port, Anthony sat on a cargo crate watching the water. It was quiet again, but not peaceful. Never peaceful. Because with every betrayal handled, another doubt crept in. If Vinny could flip, who else? The thing about legacy? It never really dies. You can bury it, rewrite it, kill the ones who try to revive it, but somewhere in the cracks, between the rumors and the silences, it waits. And sometimes, it comes back wearing a familiar face. 2 weeks after Anthony D'Angelo exiled Vinny Merlino, the city was quiet again. Too quiet. The streets stopped whispering, crews stopped moving. Even New York pulled back, waiting for what came next. To them, it looked like Anthony had finally locked things down. He hadn't, because just when you think you've handled the past finds a new door to knock on. It started with a letter, handwritten, delivered to Anthony's office. No stamp, no postmark, just slid under the door like something out of a nightmare. The handwriting was sharp, but aged. The signature? Salvatore D'Angelo, his father, dead for 10 years. Anthony read the letter 3 times before he spoke a word. It wasn't long, just a few lines. If you're reading this, someone opened a door that should have stayed shut. There's something I left behind, a debt, a secret. You need to find Louis before they do. He'll know what I mean. Don't trust him, but listen to him. S. No explanation, no address, just a name, Louis, and the weight of a ghost that wouldn't stay buried. Anthony didn't sleep that night. Instead, he called Gianni Costa, the old Scarfo associate who'd resurfaced months back, delivering cryptic warnings in Scarfo's cursed ledger. They met in the back of a church parking lot in Kensington. Cold wind, empty lot. Cigarette smoke curled in the dark. Johnny didn't flinch when Anthony handed him the letter. He read it once, then he looked up, almost smiling. "Your old man had secrets even Scarfo was scared to write down," he said. Anthony asked, "Who's Louis?" Johnny exhaled. "Louis Caldone, old soldier from the Bruno era. Tight with your dad before Scarfo took over. He vanished during the Scarfo cleanup. Everyone assumed he got clipped, but I always knew he just walked." "Walked where?" Johnny looked up. "Baltimore." "Baltimore, not far, but far enough to disappear if he wanted to." Anthony made the trip himself. No drivers, no backup, just him. He drove at night, through the wet quiet of I-95, past gas stations that never closed and exits that felt like different lifetimes. By the time he reached the city limits, the sun was bleeding through the clouds. He found Louis exactly where Johnny said he'd be, working behind the counter of a pawn shop in a dying strip mall off Eastern Avenue. He was old, thinner than he should have been, but his eyes, they were sharp. And the moment he looked up, he froze, not in fear, in recognition. "You're Sal's boy," Louis said, barely a whisper. Anthony nodded. Louis locked the front door, flipped the sign, then walked into the back without a word. Anthony followed. The back room was full of dust and old guns, some legal, most not. Louis poured 2 whiskeys, no ice. They didn't toast, they drank. And then Louis said the words that changed everything. "Your father and I killed a Fed." Anthony didn't respond. Louis continued, "Back in '82, Scarfo was getting heat from a DOJ guy out of DC, real prick. Kept poking into Atlantic City property deals. Everyone wanted him gone, but no one had the balls. Except your old man." Anthony leaned forward. "You helped him?" Louis nodded. "I drove. Your dad pulled the trigger, clean, professional. 1 shot to the temple. Dumped the body in a foundation pit under a condo project Scarfo was backing." Anthony's mind raced. "Why are you telling me this now?" Louis didn't blink. "Because someone's digging up that property." Anthony stared. "You're saying there's a body under a condo in AC?" Louis nodded. "Still wearing his badge. Still got his credentials in his jacket pocket." Anthony ran a hand over his jaw. If this got out, if someone unearthed a federal agent tied to the D'Angelo name, the commission wouldn't protect him. Hell, nobody would. He looked at Louis. Why now? Why would someone start digging after all these years? Louis's mouth twisted. Because they already found the paperwork. The guy's car, some old photos, they just don't have the body yet. Anthony asked, "Who's behind it?" Louis shook his head. "All I know is the name being floated. Eddie Rago." Eddie Rago, a name Anthony hadn't heard in years. Ex-FBI, disgraced, got bounced in the late 90s for suspected connections to organized crime, never charged, disappeared. Some said he was working security in Vegas. Others said he was dead. Now, apparently, he was back and digging into bones. Anthony stood. "You hear from him?" Louis nodded. "He came here 2 nights ago, asked about your father. Said he was looking for closure." Anthony snorted. "Closure? That what they call revenge these days?" Louis handed him an address. "Construction site. They're breaking ground again. You've got maybe 3 days before they hit the concrete." Anthony pocketed it, then turned. Before he left, Louis said one more thing. "Your father never regretted pulling that trigger." Anthony paused in the doorway. "I'm not my father," Louis smiled, eyes cold. "No, you're worse." Back in Philly, Anthony didn't waste time. He called Sal Marchetto, told him what was coming. Sal didn't hesitate. "You need to shut that down fast, because if the feds get wind of this, they won't ask questions. They'll come with chains." Anthony nodded. Sal added, "And Anthony? Don't do anything stupid. If this goes sideways, I can't cover you." "I'm not asking you to." "Good. Because there's one more thing." "What?" "Eddie Rago ain't just digging on his own. Word is, Dominic Ferrara's helping fund the project." Anthony went still. Sal finished. "They're not just trying to burn your past, they're trying to end your future." That night, Anthony sat in his car for a long time, watching the rain crawl across the windshield. A federal body under concrete, a ghost with a badge, a corrupt ex-agent with a vendetta, and Dominic, back from the shadows, pushing buttons from afar. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about erasing the D'Angelo name, legacy and all. But Anthony had come too far to get buried under someone else's dirt. This time, he wouldn't just react, he'd strike. Not like Scarfo, not loud, surgical, and final. Atlantic City, the city of second chances, rigged games, and bad decisions dressed in neon. Once Scarfo's personal gold mine, the prize that turned him from a soldier into a tyrant. Now, Anthony D'Angelo was back, not for profit, not for pleasure, but to stop his father's ghost from crawling out of the ground. The condo site sat just off Pacific Avenue, in the shadow of shuttered casinos and overbuilt dreams. 10 floors of aging concrete, most of it abandoned since the last real boom 15 years earlier. The new developer, a corporate shell backed by a revitalization grant, had no clue what they were sitting on. Or maybe they did. Anthony stood at the edge of the pit at 6 a.m. Construction halted for the weekend. Wind cut across the lot, sharp and salty. Behind him, Vinny's old contact, Mickey Tansey, stood in a hard hat and dirty boots, acting like a site foreman. He wasn't. Mickey was an ex-union bulldog. Had helped bury more bodies than he poured foundations. Loyalty wasn't cheap with him, but it lasted when paid. "They're due to pour the new foundation Monday," Mickey said, spitting into the dirt. "They hit the concrete pad from 82 already. Half the rebar's rusted through. Engineers flagged it. They'll demo and dig deeper." Anthony nodded. "How far down?" 2 stories, maybe more. "And if they hit something?" Mickey didn't answer. He didn't have to. Anthony stared into the hole, 30 feet wide, 20 deep. If Louis Caldone was right, somewhere down there, under a forgotten piece of Scarfo's empire, was the one thing that could burn everything Anthony had built, the body of a federal agent buried with his badge. And now, ex-FBI disgraced enforcer Eddie Rago was using this dig like a scalpel. cutting right into the softest part of the D'Angelo name. Anthony lit a cigarette. Time was running out. Back in his hotel room, Anthony locked the door and opened a small briefcase he'd brought from Philly. Inside was a burner phone, 3 USB drives, and a leather folder. He opened the folder first. Inside were copies of property transfers from the early 80s. Scarfo had used dozens of front companies to buy up blocks of land through straw buyers. One of them, Blue Harbor Holdings LLC, had bought the land this condo sat on in 1981, then sold it back to a public development group a year later. On the surface, clean. But tucked in the bottom right corner of a scanned deed transfer was a name Anthony had seen before: Dominic Ferrara. Back when he was still a young real estate lawyer in North Jersey, Dominic had signed off on the dissolution of Blue Harbor Holdings, which meant Dominic had been connected to Scarfo decades ago, which meant he knew about the body, which meant this whole thing, Rago, the dig, the photos, even Vinny's betrayal, wasn't about justice. It was a setup. A long, slow play to drag Anthony's bloodline back into the dirt and kill what was left of Philly's independence. Anthony called Gianni Costa next. Gianni picked up on the second ring. "You back in AC?" "Yeah." "You found it?" "Not yet." There was a pause. "Then stop wasting time," Gianni said. "Because if Rago gets the body, he's not bringing it to court. He's bringing it to Dominic. And Dominic's gonna walk it into the commission and say, 'This is who you trusted.'" Anthony rubbed his temple. "You ever hear of Blue Harbor Holdings?" Gianni went quiet. "Jesus," he muttered. "You found the trail?" "I need confirmation." Was Dominic working for Scarfo back then? Gianni sighed. "Unofficially, yeah. Everyone knew. He didn't wear colors, but he made deals happen, kept things clean, always smiling." "And he buried this?" "No," Gianni said. "He let Scarfo do the dirty work, then scrubbed the prints. He thought time would wash it all away." Anthony exhaled. He was wrong. Gianni paused. "You sure you want to open this door, kid?" Anthony looked out the window toward the site. It's already open. That night, Anthony met Mickey Tanzi again. They walked the lot in silence until Mickey stopped near the pit, looking out over the exposed concrete and rotting beams. "I can get you 6 hours, Mickey said. "Sunday night, after the union guys leave, before the morning crew shows up." Anthony nodded. "What do I need?" 2 diggers, floodlights, and someone you trust to keep the mouth shut." Anthony already had someone in mind. Dario Russo, a quiet soldier from South Philly, early 40s. No record, no heat. Ran a crew that specialized in cleanup, trash removal, demolition, junk hauling. But behind the licenses and uniforms, Dario's guys were precise, not killers, barriers. Anthony gave him the location, the time, and said only this: "If we find something, it never happened." Dario nodded. And that was that. Sunday night came like a funeral. Anthony stood in the center of the pit under harsh floodlights, wind kicking dust into his eyes. Dario and 2 of his guys worked slow and deliberate, digging through the old foundation like surgeons. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. At 1:47, one of the crew hit something solid. Metal, a dented badge case. A shoe with a federal serial number stamped into the insole. And then, a skull. They didn't speak. They didn't react. Dario pulled the remains out gently. Everything was degraded, but the shape was there. A .22 slug still embedded in the side of the skull. Execution style, exactly how Louis had said it went down. The badge was cracked, rusted, but still legible. DOJ, Special Agent Ray McGuire. The ghost was real. Anthony stared at the bones, jaw tight. This was it. This was the bulletproof evidence that could end him, even if he hadn't pulled the trigger. Blood was blood, and Dominic knew exactly how to use it. Dario looked at Anthony. What now? Anthony didn't answer. Not yet, because the move that came next, it couldn't be rushed. It had to be perfect. Then the body was wrapped, sealed, and moved into a secure cold storage unit beneath one of Anthony's construction fronts in Kensington. No digital trail, no security cams, no names on the paperwork. Then Anthony made one phone call, not to Sal Marchetto, not to Gianni, but directly to Dominic Ferrara. Dominic answered with his usual smirk. "So the prodigal son calls." "I found your boneyard," Anthony said calmly. "You buried the wrong skeleton." Silence. Then, "You wouldn't dare go public with it. That body burns your father." "No," Anthony replied. "That body burns you." Dominic scoffed. "I was never there. You signed the property transfer. I have the deed, the timestamps. You whitewashed Scarfo's play. That makes you an accessory." Dominic's voice dropped. "You go down with me." "No," Anthony said. "You go down alone." Then he sent the second photo, not of the body, but of the badge. Clean. Legible, traceable. Dominic didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. Then, "What do you want?" Anthony smiled. "Two things." The next morning, Dominic Ferrara withdrew his backing from the Atlantic City development project, pulled the permits, froze the funding, gone, no press release, no warning, just silence. And then, he made a call to the commission, issuing a formal statement. He was stepping away from all influence in Philadelphia operations. Effective immediately. Anthony didn't brag. He didn't celebrate. He just sat in the cold office of a half-finished skyscraper overlooking the city his father once died for, and let himself breathe. He had done the impossible, beaten New York, buried a federal ghost, and rewritten his family's legacy on his own terms. But in this life, there's no such thing as peace, only pause. And in the shadows of that pause, someone else was already watching. The hardest part about surviving the life isn't the blood. It's the quiet afterward. Anthony D'Angelo had beaten back the commission's overreach. He'd outplayed Dominic Ferrara. He'd silenced the ghost of a federal agent buried beneath Scarfo's concrete graveyard. The game should have been over, but it never ends. Not really. Because once your name means something in this world, once it holds weight, fear, respect, someone always wants to take it. And sometimes, that someone comes from right under your roof. It started with a dinner. Sunday night. Family only. Anthony had kept those sacred, even through the madness. Once a month he sat down with his mother, his Aunt Teresa, his cousins, even the ones who hated what he'd become. And that night, his cousin Nico showed up. Nico D'Angelo, barely 25. Clean cut, university degree. Supposedly the legit one in the family. Anthony hadn't seen him in almost a year, not since he declined a job in the construction front Anthony ran out of Fishtown. Said he wanted to make it on his own. Now here he was, all smiles and sharp clothes, like nothing had happened. Anthony noticed the watch first, a Patek Philippe. Too expensive for a kid working freelance marketing gigs. He didn't say anything, just nodded, let the meal play out, and watched. That night, Anthony ran his name. He didn't use the front-end servers. He didn't ask his guys. He used an encrypted backdoor system built by a former cyber fraud hacker, now on Anthony's quiet payroll. What came back made Anthony go still. Nico had been in contact with Eddie Rago 3 times, first by phone, then once in person, and then a third, less traceable exchange. Digital. Routed through a fake LLC in Baltimore, the name of the LLC? Seaside Revitalization Partners, the same shell group that funded the Atlantic City dig. Anthony didn't react. Not right away. He stared at the screen for a long time, remembering Nico as a boy, chasing footballs in their grandmother's backyard, always smiling, always watching, too smart for his own good, too proud. He hadn't come to that Sunday dinner to reconnect. He'd come to see if Anthony knew. And now Anthony did. 2 days passed. Anthony didn't reach out, didn't send anyone. He needed confirmation, not just proof, motive. So he pulled one more thread. Gianni Costa. They met behind the butcher's market on 9th Street, just like they used to back in the early days. Anthony handed Johnny the file. Johnny whistled low. "Kid's been busy." "What's his angle?" Anthony asked. Johnny tapped the screen. "Look at the timeline. He starts getting hot with Rago the same month Vinny flipped. This ain't just business, it's vengeance." Anthony narrowed his eyes. "You think he's trying to finish what Vinny started?" Gianni shook his head. "Worse. I think Nico believes he's cleaning your mess." It made sense. Nico had grown up hearing the stories about Anthony, about his father, about the blood that built their name. He saw the violence, the paranoia, the betrayals. And maybe, just maybe, he decided he didn't want to be part of it. He wanted to end it, even if it meant selling his own cousin out to do it. Anthony called him the next morning. Cool. Casual. "Let's take a drive." Nico didn't hesitate. He showed up dressed like he was going to a tech startup. Clean sneakers, bomber jacket, no fear. They drove through the city for an hour. No words, just streets they both knew too well. Eventually, Anthony pulled into a long-forgotten dockside lot by the river. No cameras, no echoes, just water and wind. He killed the engine. Nico looked out the windshield, then said, "You know, don't you?" Anthony didn't look at him. "Yeah," Nico exhaled. "Okay?" No denial, no story. Just that. "Okay." "You think you're doing the right thing?" Anthony asked, voice low. Nico nodded. "I think someone has to stop this cycle. I watched what this life did to you, to Uncle Sal, to Vinny. It kills everything. It doesn't build. It just survives." Anthony turned to him. "Then why didn't you walk away? You could have disappeared." Nico looked back, jaw tight, because the only way to kill something rotten is from the inside. The words hung heavy between them. Anthony stared at him. This kid who shared his blood, who sat at the same tables, who listened to the same war stories, now sitting across from him, not as family, but as the next threat. "You were going to give them everything," Anthony said. Nico nodded. "I still can." Anthony looked back at the water. The silence between them now wasn't peace. It was history. "You know," Anthony said, "when I was your age, I thought I could outthink this life, that I could make it clean, build it better." Nico didn't speak. "But you can't make something clean when it was built in blood. You can only manage the mess." Nico looked away. "That's your mistake." Anthony nodded, then reached under the seat and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. Inside, photos of the Atlantic City site, of the body, of Rago, of Nico, proof, hard and irreversible, of every move he made. Anthony held it out. "You want out? Fine. Walk away. But you take this and you disappear. No more moves, no more betrayal." Nico looked at the envelope, then back at Anthony. "You're giving me a way out? I'm giving you one chance. And if I say no..." Anthony's eyes didn't flinch. "Then I send this envelope to New York." The weight of it all fell between them. And Nico, smart, proud, reckless Nico, did something Anthony didn't expect. He took the envelope, stood up, walked to the passenger door, paused, then said, "You're better than I thought, Ant. That's what makes this all so tragic." And with that, he left. Anthony didn't watch him go. He just sat there, alone, as the river lapped at the dock. The D'Angelo name had been tested again, and it had held. But something in him cracked. Not from betrayal, not from fear, but from the final understanding that in this world, even your own blood might come for your crown. And sometimes, the only way to lead is to be the last one standing. There's a moment after war ends when nobody knows what to do with peace. The guns go quiet. The bodies are buried. The enemies vanish into silence. And all that's left is the weight of survival. Anthony D'Angelo had survived more than most men ever would. He'd buried betrayals, outmaneuvered New York, neutralized the ghost of Scarfo, and exiled his own blood to protect what he built. But now, there was nothing left to kill, nothing left to fear, just the sound of his own name echoing through a city that was no longer sure what he stood for. It started with fewer calls, no problems, no fires. The captain stopped asking for permission before making moves. The street bosses handled disputes without checking in. It wasn't disrespect. It was something worse. Indifference. Anthony had cleaned things up too well. He'd made himself so untouchable, so removed from the dirt, that the men underneath him had forgotten what it meant to follow. He wasn't feared. He wasn't loved. He was a shadow. A quiet king in a castle no one visited. The final sign came in the form of a black envelope left on his desk one morning. Inside was a single note, typed, no signature. When a lion forgets how to roar, the hyenas stop hiding. He didn't react, didn't panic. He just folded the note and placed it inside his drawer, next to the .38 snub nose his father once carried. The message wasn't a threat. It was a test, one last invitation to become what they all expected him to be, to go back to fear, to blood, to the law of the street. But Anthony wasn't sure he had it in him anymore. He sat in his office past midnight that night, staring at the city lights. Philly didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a reflection. The city was still his, but only technically. It ran because he let it, not because he pushed it. And that was the line every boss feared. The moment your name becomes ceremonial. He thought about calling Sal Marchetto, or Gianni, or even Nico, but the silence in his bones told him what he already knew. This wasn't a problem to solve. It was a curtain call. The next morning, Anthony did something he hadn't done in years. He went alone, no driver, no crew, to the old Union Hall on Tasker Street, where his father once ran sit-downs behind closed doors. It hadn't been used in over a decade. Dust covered the tables. Cigarette burns still marked the arms of the chairs. He sat at the head of the table, lit a cigarette, and waited. One by one, they came. Every captain, every earner, every man who mattered. They didn't speak when they entered. They knew what this was. Anthony let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then he said, "I've spent the last 3 years trying to build something different, not soft, not weak, just smarter." He looked around. Some of them wouldn't meet his eyes. "I buried ghosts. I kept the commission off our backs. I spared family. And in return, I've heard the whispers." He stood slowly. "I'm not Scarfo. I'm not Bruno. I never wanted to rule by fear." He looked each of them in the eye. But don't mistake that for weakness. The room held its breath. Then Anthony did something no one expected. He took out a small piece of paper from his jacket and slid it across the table. It was a list, 7 names. The captains who had quietly started running independent routes, keeping side profits, moving weight without authorization. Anthony didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just said, "Everyone on this list has 2 options, fall in line or leave the table." The air shifted, because in that moment, every man in that room realized something terrifying. Anthony hadn't gotten softer, he'd gotten sharper, more surgical. He didn't need blood to prove power. He used information, and he had it all. 3 days later, 5 of the names on the list made formal oaths, reaffirming loyalty, handing over percentages. The other 2, gone, no word, no bodies, just vanished. And nobody asked questions, because now the city remembered. The lion could still roar. But even after the dust settled, Anthony didn't celebrate. He didn't hold a feast, didn't call in debts. He sat in the same office day after day, staring at the skyline, wondering if maybe, just maybe, surviving this long wasn't the victory. Maybe the real win was knowing when to stop. 1 week later, he met with Sal Marchetto in a restaurant back room in Brooklyn. Sal poured wine, didn't ask why Anthony had come. He knew. Anthony said, "I'm done." Sal leaned back. "You sure?" Anthony nodded. "I proved what I had to prove. I kept the name clean. I made it through all of it." Sal asked, "Who takes the chair?" Anthony answered, "No one." There was silence. Then Sal chuckled. "You want to walk away and leave a power vacuum? You think that'll end well?" Anthony smiled for the first time in months. "There's no vacuum. There's a structure. Let it run. Let them handle their corners. If they need help, they call. If they need answers, they learn the hard way." Sal raised a brow. "And what if someone comes knocking again? New York, or worse?" Anthony looked him in the eye. "I'll still be watching, just not from behind a desk." And with that, Anthony D'Angelo stepped away. No gunfight, no betrayal, no blood on the floor. Just a man who survived the storm long enough to walk out of it. Not clean, not innocent, but alive. And still in control, because walking away by your own hand, that's the only real power left in the life. He moved north, changed his number, set up in a quiet town nobody cared about, a place where no one said his name with fear or awe. He walked his dog in the mornings, read the papers at diners, and every once in a while, when the phone rang from a blocked number, he picked up and gave advice, just enough to keep the wheel turning. The city never forgot him, and the name D'Angelo, it stayed respected, not because of the violence, not because of the legend, but because he left when he still could. And in this life, that makes you more than a survivor. That makes you a ghost with a crown.